Hey everybody, Professor Gassimi here. Thanks for joining. Today we're going to be covering Homework 0. Specifically, we're going to go through the web application template, which contains AI agent integration. I'll be showing you how it works from a functional perspective. I'm then going to switch over to my IDE, and I'm going to show you what the code looks like. This should help you with implementing some of the things that are required in Homework 0. So let's jump into it. So here what I have shared on the screen is the Homework 0 AI agent template that was shared with you. The system is designed, as we'll see when we go to the code, in using some front-end tools which include Vue and Tailwind, Vue 3 specifically, and Tailwind is a CSS package if you're not familiar with it. So a lot of the styling here is not my doing. I'm just taking advantage of the beautiful CSS library that was publicly available. But the content here and the functionality are things that I built into your homework template. So you can see here when you land on the main page of the browser, you have a section that in this case is about me, and I just list some facts about myself, and then I've got some things that I hope you're going to get from the class: technical skills, practical experience, problem-solving skills, and so on. You can also see that here on the right-hand side, I have this AI chat assistant that's built in. And this AI chat assistant is live. It's actually hooked up to OpenAI's API endpoint. And I can ask it questions about things that are on this page, such as, let me think of one. So how many papers did Dr. Gassimi publish? And what you can see here is it says Dr. Gassimi published over 70 peer-reviewed scientific papers, which is true. That's what it in fact says here on the About Me part of the page. Okay, and so what this application instantiates is a very simple AI agent. It has kind of two steps. There is a person asking a question. There is the AI agent receiving content that's relevant to that question, in this case from the web page, and issuing a response on the basis of both the prompt as well as the relevant content that's provided at the time of the inference from the LLM. Okay, we're using in the backend GPT 3.5. When we switch over to a review of the code, I'll show that to you. There's some other small functional things here that I'll just demonstrate clearly. You can clear the chat so that if it gets too busy, you can do that. It does handle overflow and other kind of CSS styling things that you should not need to take care of. For clarity, we're doing this in the context of a web application this semester, not so much because of the web application, but because I'd like you to build some system skills. And part of system skills is being able to integrate AI into other systems. Okay? Don't care as much about your CSS. Please feel free to rely on external resources, including agents, to help you with that. I'm more interested in your mastery of the integration of these agents and the workflows to achieve certain system functionalities. Okay, so this is the home page we've already visited. You can see here I've got a second page, AI agents, as well as a login. This login is not going to be used for now. It's going to be important for upcoming assignments, but I'm gonna activate it anyway. Notice before I do that, I'm gonna just ask another question here. Let's say, tell me a joke. Okay, if I say tell me a joke, I end up getting, how good is this joke? Why was the math book sad? Because it had too many problems. That one's actually pretty good. Actually, that one's pretty good. So if you come to the login, note that this text was green. If we come to the login and I already have my credentials sort of popped in here and I sign in, it takes me back to the main page. If I ask it again, you might notice that the text is blue, and this is because I've configured the system so that it retains in the session whether you've logged in or not. And we can use that as part of our agentic workflow. We might answer different kinds of questions or allow the agent to do different kinds of activities, issue different kinds of responses, depending on whether a person is logged in or not, and maybe even the role of that person. Okay, so I've built this login system. It's available in the code that we'll be reviewing as well. Last thing I want to show you here is this AI Agents tab. Okay, you can see here that there's only one item, a resume chat agent, which we can click through to. And in this resume chat agent, I have a extremely simple boiled down version of my resume. This is definitely not up to date. I just threw this in here for illustrative purposes so that you could kind of play with it. And as we move from one place to the other, the context of the AI chat assistant on the right-hand side also updates. So I can ask here, for example, what courses did he teach at Michigan State University? And you can see it actually pulls it. It pulls all three of the courses that were listed here. CSE 477, that's true. 847 and 491. That's our class here today. Okay, so you should be able to take this AI embedded web application and make some modifications to it to put your own resume, to put your own about me and your own image. And you've already got a pretty stellar CV, a really impressive CV that a potential employer can chat with. So that was the first thing I want you to do this semester in your homework 0 is just kind of pre-configure this tool that I built so that you have your resume in it and demonstrate to me that you can chat with it, you can answer questions about your resume, and so on. Be good for you, hopefully get you a nice job. You can send me a tip when you get that nice job if it works out. Okay, this is the first assignment. What we're going to do is switch over now to the code in the backend, and I'm going to give you a lightning tour of that so that you know how to navigate it, what parts you should pay more attention to, and what parts you can avoid. So give me a second while I switch over. Okay. Okay, so my screen should be visible now. And okay, so my screen should be visible now. Okay, my screen should be visible now. What I've done is I have opened my preferred IDE, which is Cursor. If you've not used Cursor, it is a fork of Visual Studio, which basically has AI integration natively. So it makes, some of the syntactical things around writing code, I think, a lot faster and easier. If you've not used Cursor or you want to try it in this class, definitely recommend it. It also has an agentic capability built in where you can ask questions about code bases, including the one that I'm providing to you, and it can help answer questions, kind of point you to where certain files are and so on. So definitely something I recommend. You can use another IDE if you prefer that too. Okay, so what I have here in the IDE is all the documents that go into homework 0. Some of these matter. Some of these are less relevant. I'm going to go through them one at a time briefly. And kind of, if they're less relevant, I'm going to cover them quickly. If they're not relevant, I'm not going to cover them. And if they're very relevant, I'm going to cover them deeply. Okay. First thing I want to know, the Docker file and Docker Compose here. These are, in fact, very relevant. They're what we use to orchestrate the container for homework 0. When you read the actual homework 0 file that was released, the README that was released with the homework, it's going to tell you how you compose this Docker file. It's not a lot of work. It's like one line of code. But this basically outlines all of the instructions that have to be followed by the machine in order to stand up the database, hook the database to a Flask app, which is what we're using in this particular case, and all the other orchestration of the backend infrastructure so that you can run one line of code and get your application stood up. Having a Docker file is also really useful if you want to take your web application and put it on the web for real one day, because a lot of services, Google Cloud, AWS, and so on, make it trivial to host applications if you have a Docker file with them. So I intentionally wanted to give you this Docker information. You don't need to review it for this class. I don't anticipate you'll be making significant changes, and if changes are required, I will release them as part of the course. So you don't need to pay attention to this. Initialization of the DB is the same thing. This is just setting up Postgres for the purposes of orchestration. Don't need to pay attention to that. Your requirements.txt here, this is something you might have to change. So when you first start up the web application, Flask sits at the back. Flask is a Python web application backend, and you may have to add certain things to this requirement.txt if there are libraries you want to use. Let's say Pandas, if we're doing something that's data science-y in the back, okay, or NumPy. Great, so this is the important stuff here. App.py is not important. This is just initialization of the Flask app. One thing that is important is this .env file, which I will not be opening because it contains OpenAI API keys. You will be creating this. There's specific instructions within Homework 0 on how you do that. Okay, let's come here to the Flask application itself. And to make this a little easier, I'm going to minimize the stuff first, and then we're going to go through it one bit at a time. Okay. So what you notice within the Flask application is there's a database folder, a static folder, a templates folder, a utilities folder, and then there's a couple of Python files. Let's start with looking at the Python files. This init.py, you shouldn't need to change it. It's a bunch of configuration things that are responsible for orchestrating the database, loading the configuration from config.py and applying certain settings. I highly doubt you will need to touch init.py. You may want to review it if you're interested in the web application sort of tooling that we're doing this semester. Config.py is also something you probably won't need to touch. Basically what it does is it will import from your .env file, which you'll be creating in Homework 0. There's some specific instructions on how you do that. It just imports everything from that environmental file so that it's available to your application, including, for example, what your secret key is, what your OpenAI API key is, and so on and so forth. Okay. I have here some kind of recommended or default configurations that it falls back on if you don't specify it in your .env. But it's best practices for you to specify all these variables in the .env. Again, I cover that in the Homework 0 README. Last one here. This is one of the important files, is routes.py. So this is what is responsible for connecting the location on the browser's URL to what you see on the screen. So for example, when we were on the home page of the web application I showed you, this backend function was responsible for servicing the content that you were seeing on the page. And what you can see is it returned this render template, which is just responsible for taking an HTML page and rendering it on the front end. And the specific page that it renders is this thing, dynamic HTML, which we'll go through here in a minute. The page type was home, as implied by the fact that it's the home page. And we pass the user's information, their email specifically, if they're logged in. Okay? This is so that we could display the user's login name in the top left-hand side of the screen. You may recall there was a tab for AI agents. You can see this is laid out exactly the same way. Only thing I've changed is the page type to be from home to agents. And for the resume page, very similarly, I've just changed the page type to be from agents to resume. So when we look through this dynamic page HTML, you'll see how these two variables interact. Why don't we do that now by coming here to templates and opening dynamic page.html. What you can see here is that this page, which is based on a Jinja template, takes a kind of standard layout which imports all of our CSS, all of our JavaScript, and so on. and it dynamically loads a Vue.js component, which we'll be covering in this lecture, and it adds a Vue container with the same name as the page type. Okay, so just for clarity, let's come look over here. In routes.py, we had a page type, home. This is going to dynamic page HTML. So here's dynamic page HTML. Here's that page type. So then you're going to tell me, well, hey, what does this mean? Like this ID, div ID page type container, like what does this touch? What that touches is here in JavaScript, you can see we have one JavaScript file for each of the pages that were enumerated in routes.py. So let's go back to routes.py. What do you notice? We've got home, we've got agents, we've got resume, and so on. So over here, we've got home, we've got agents, we've got resume. We've also got login, which is a little further down in routes.py, and we've got chat, which is that side panel, which is sort of operates independently. Okay, let's do this. Why don't we start with just this first route, and let's follow sort of the logic through all the way to the end so you understand how to view it, how to modify it, how to extend it, and so on. Here, we see that the page type is home. We have a dynamic page HTML, so we go to dynamic page HTML, and we say that we're going to be making a container, a Vue container, in this case called home container. So what is a home container? Well, in home Vue, this is a home container. You can see it starts with a template. This is Vue.js format, which is, if you're not familiar with, Vue is like I think it's the best personally of the contemporary reactive web application frameworks, because it doesn't require you, it's progressive in the sense that you can have regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it integrates with that instead of forcing you to do everything within their ecosystem like React does. So if you've not used Vue, but you've used React, I think Vue will be very easy for you to pick up. It's similar in more ways than it's different. Okay, but anyway, you basically define a template. This is effectively the HTML file that got displayed on the page. You can look here, for example. Here's that Professor Ghassemi and then the bio information that I had about myself. You see that? That's what's right here. So if I change it here, it will change in the front end. You can see here I've got the image. That was the shot of me to the left that we had in the web app. Let me see if I can pull it back here. Yeah, right here in the web app. That's what it corresponds to. And what I have down here are those things on the class, like what I hope you get from the class. You can see this is all just static content, right? Nothing significant. In order for it to be usable by Vue.js, towards the tail end, you have to run a setup, have a return for any dynamic or reactive variables. In this case, there's nothing dynamic on the page. It's a static page. So it's a very simple kind of workflow. So let's repeat so that it's 100% clear. For each of the routes that exist in routes.py, where we have a dynamic page, there's a page type, let's say home. That corresponds to one of these files, home Vue.js, where we have the template, the HTML, and then a little bit of Vue.js content that helps us with dynamic elements. In this case, there's nothing dynamic, so there's no content. Okay, great. So if you understood this for home, then agents is exactly the same way. Resume is a little different. I'll show you here in a minute. So let me just prove to you that agents is the same way. Let's open it up. Notice here, I again just have a bunch of HTML that mimics exactly what was displayed on the screen. You can see, for example, here it's got, I've developed an AI agent that lets you chat with my resume, blah, blah, blah. If we come over here to the AI agents page, you can see the text is right there. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Down here, not much going on, just like our home page. Coming back to routes.py, if we come to the third one here, resume, this is a little different. So let's open it up. Let's come here to resume view. So here what you're going to notice is that it looks at first glance like it's HTML, right? But it's actually not. Do you notice here how we have these v-if? These are related to Vue. So when you see the v-if, v-else, and so on, these are specific Vue.js commands that allow us to dynamically write HTML content as a function of some variables. In this case, v-if loading, so as a function of the state of the loading state, it will show loading resume if it's loading. If it's done loading, then it's going to show the resume content. If there's an error, it's going to throw some error content. In this case, it will say failed to load resume. Okay, so this allows us to basically write dynamic HTML, right? And, with if statements and else statements, which is really annoying if you're not using a reactive framework. You have to write this complex JavaScript or have the backend constantly shoot new information to the front, and it becomes a giant nightmare. So Vue basically handles this for us, but you gotta learn the syntax. So this is the resume content which you saw. Now, one thing which we're going to cover here in this tutorial is that this resume content is based on some data that sits in a database. And that data, when it arrives, appears as a JSON object. And what this is doing is that JSON object contains institution. So let's come back over here. View the resume. You see the first institution is Michigan State University. Well, here we have, for each of the institutions in these IDs and the institution IDs, come over here and put the institution's header as an H2. And let's, underneath that, put the institutional department, the institutional address, the city, the state, and the zip. So basically it takes the JSON object that's passed to it and it's inserting, actually very similar to the way you do with format strings in Python, the department, the address, the city, the state, and the zip, which is precisely what you see show up here if it was available in the database. So you can see I didn't put it in some of the cases. I only put for NIH, Bethesda, Maryland. Here I put more information, so more information showed up. Okay, we're going to go through the database so you see how this is formatted as well, because you're going to have to change that in homework 0. The same is true of positions. There's a combination of v-ifs and some v-for loops that we use to sort of iteratively build various parts of the interface. So I won't take you through all this code, but just wanted to let you know that I've given you this as a starter, right? So I take some data that comes from the backend, and Vue.js takes that JSON object. It parses that JSON object to dynamically create what's in the front. Okay. So let's look down here. You might notice that this setup is a little different than what we had. And by a little different, I mean it basically has stuff in it, unlike what we had in home. Here's home. You can see it was empty. Resume has a couple of things in it. Well, the first thing that you see here is it has resume data. Okay. You might also notice that resume data up here has a corresponding location return. This is a Vue.js-ism. Basically things you want to use up here that are dynamic, you also have to have them down here in the return. Okay, so we have the resume data, we have loading, we have error, which you can see show up down here, and then we have load resume data, again, which also shows up down here in the return. What does this load resume data do? Well, it calls an endpoint /API/resume. And then as long as it was successful, it takes this variable resume data and it sets it equal to whatever that API returned. So where is this API? And where is this resume data? Well, this resume data is precisely what's used up here. Look, load resume data. Here's the resume data. If the resume data exists, then for each of the items in the resume data, dot, 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 dot. See that? So we're unpacking it. Okay. So just workflow once more. In Vue, we kind of write out what we want to get usually from the backend, what our variables are. We call APIs to get that data. In this case, we're calling API/resume. And then we can use that dynamically so that we can generate the web page upstairs following Vue.js's format. Okay, that's the basic workflow. Let me show you where this API resume is. Let's come back to routes.py. And hey, here it is, API resume. It exists in our backend. So what does this do? Well, you can see it calls a database function, getResumeData, and then it just passes that data through a JSON to the front. That's it. So when that function calls the backend here, this guy goes to the database, he grabs the data that's needed, passes it to the front end, and now the front end can iterate through that JSON, dynamically create the HTML, and so on. Okay, that's this API for the resume. So we've gotten through most of the application here, right? We got through agents, we got through the resume, but before we move on to the chat, which is a little more involved, I want to cover this database class. db.getResumeData comes from the database class, and the database class, as you can see over here, comes from utils database. So let's go find utils database. Well, here on the left, we can come to the utils folder. It's down here. Let's open it. And you can see, oh, there it is. We needed utils.database. Here is utils.database. Let's open it. And there is getResumeData. It's a long sequence of SQL queries that selects all institutions, and then selects all positions where the institution ID matches one of those, and selects all experiences where it matches one of the positions, and so on, to create a JSON object that we package up and we send to the front. Okay? Well, where does this resume data, like, where is this data? This table declared. It's declared, if I minimize this real quick, up here at the very top. So what you might notice here, let me minimize this. This initialization is not important. Well, actually, I think this initialization is probably important for me to take you through. I set some tables that are going to be imported. Where do I declare these tables? I declare them here in database using these two subfolders, create tables and initial data. What do you notice? Under self.tables, there's institutions, positions, experiences, skills, and users. Well, you see how I have these create table statements, these SQL statements here in the create tables folder, one for each of the tables that has to be created. Okay, so let's go open one of them up, like institutions. Oh, here we go. So this is the Postgres query that's used to create the table for institutions. It has an institution ID, a type, a name, a department, an address, a city, a state, and so on. Same is true of positions, same is true of skills, and so on and so forth. I initialized this template this way so that, not that you need to be locked to only building a resume, but if you know how to create tables in the context of a resume where there's dependencies, you could create other tables with other dependencies and route it through the exact same pipes so that you can connect a database to the LLM. That's going to be necessary, right, if you want to build an agent. A database is going to be an important tool for that. Okay, so these are what we use to initialize or instantiate each of the tables in the database, and then these are the data that exist within them. So you can see I've got here the 3 classes that I covered: CSE 491, CSE 847, 477. One thing you'll be doing in the homework is taking this initial data, taking the tables, and you're going to be updating these so that you get experience sort of changing the data around. It should flow through and reflect your CV instead of the skeleton CV of mine that I put within the web application. Okay, great. So that's the data. Let's now come back to our database.py. Okay. So what we were saying was when we instantiate this database class, there's some things that get pulled from the config. You shouldn't have to worry about that. It flows through from your environmental variable. These tables get initialized. Encryption is handled by me automatically. The most important thing you actually need from this database class is this query function. So you can go into routes.py or somewhere else, even within the database class, and do db.query. Put in a SQL style query, select star from users as an example, and it will get you an answer. Okay? You don't need to worry about reading this too much. You can modify it if you want. It should work for everything you need in the class right out of the box. This getResumeData function is something I obviously wrote just for the purpose of homework 0. You'll probably, as the semester goes on, be writing other functions that do other things with data. For example, let's say we want to build a retrieval augmented generation database. So we want to be able to ask a question from the LLM, figure out how to write a SQL query to query something in the database. We might want to add that somewhere in here with some fail-safes and other mechanics to do that interaction, okay? So this is table creation content. It allows you, that handles inserting and inserting rows into a database. We show you sort of an example of how to do that. You can open up the code and see examples there as well as within create tables. Not much for you to review here. You can ask questions if you get stuck on how to use it. Either ask your favorite LLM. It'll tell you how you use these functions, or you can just ask us in the class and we'll help you. The last 3 here are authentication functions. So this is how I make sure that a person, when they're logging in, is who they say they are. This gets the user's email and the user's role from the session. You should not need to modify these or the encryption functions. I wrote them so that the application that you'd have available would be as close to complete if you wanted to continue to develop it after the class. No need to touch encryption. You probably won't need to touch authentication. If you do, I'll specify it in future homeworks. Okay, summary. This getResumeData and the query function are probably the only 2 you're going to need for now. So just focus your attention on these 2 as you're working on the homework. All right, let's go back to our routes.py and continue through. So we covered home, we covered agents, we covered resume, and we covered the resume API. What we have not covered is the chat route. Okay, this one's a little bit more involved, as you can see here, but I promise you it's not too bad. So what does this chat route do? Well, you can see here the chat route, sometimes the best way to understand what a function does is, on a web app, is to look at what it anticipates as an input. In this case, it's anticipating a post request, which means it expects that it's going to get a JSON object. And it's also going to return down here a AI chat request return. So if we understand what this AI chat request does, we're going to be able, and what the data is that comes in here, we'll understand how this function works as we review the center. Okay? The data piece is pretty easy. As you can see, it's a JSON object. The JSON object contains a message, and it contains some page content. So your question to me is going to be, well, Dr. Ghasemi, where exactly is this chat with AI function? Like, how exactly is the JSON data getting to this? And it's getting to it the exact same way that this API resume was getting called, the exact same way. So we have in the front end, here in chat view, a call. And within that call, let me come down here. Under here, send message to AI, this eventually calls the chat AI endpoint that I just mentioned. We will go through this Vue.js file. It looks like a lot. The only thing you have to touch here is the stuff above these helper functions. So it's a very small chunk of code. It's, less than 100 lines that you'll have to touch. Okay, very small. Helper functions here are things that you should not have to modify or deal with. Your workflows will be strictly with the stuff above line 132 here. Okay, so let's come back to routes. So what were we saying? This route, chat API, is what's handling those chat requests that we had in the front end here. Okay, when I typed something in on this chat, it gets routed eventually to this endpoint, chat AI. So what happens? Well, the message that got typed in gets pulled out. For example, this message that I had here about tell me a joke, that gets pulled out. And then on top of that, the page content. So whatever page I'm on, the front end grabs the HTML and it sends it over here to me in the back end. In this case, I'm printing it. I'm logging basically what happens, and you can see that when you run the application, you will have a console that prints just like any other Python script, where you can see the message in the page content. I instantiate the ChatGPT client, and I'm going to show you where this code is in a minute. And as long as there's content on the page, right, then I'm going to clean that content using a function I wrote. This basically throws out everything, all the divs, all the p tags, all the enumerated lists. It just keeps the text that's on the web page. I define a system prompt here for the LLM. And then what do? I call this handle AI chat request, and I pass in which AI agent I want to use, ChatGPT in this case, what message came from the user, tell me a joke, what the system prompt is, that's what I wrote up here, okay? And finally, what room to transmit this to. This room is not important, you won't have to change it. It's an artifact of socket IO that you use for transmitting information from the front end to the back end dynamically. Okay, we also pass in the page content, which is the cleaned information. Let's go to the handle AI chat request. This is handled in the LLM utility here. Okay, how would you know that? Well, you see handle AI chat request. If you come up to the top, you can see it's in utils.llm. So let's go open utils.llm. Okay, here it is. This ChatGPT client, which is what we called in routes. Let's come back down here. Let me show you. Remember this line? We called the ChatGPT client. That's defined up here. This is the ChatGPT client. Basically, all it does is it takes what's in your config file, the API key, which OpenAI model you want to use, maximum tokens that should be returned, the temperature of the model, and other factors, and it initializes it for you. Okay? If you don't understand what some of these parameters mean, please don't worry. We'll cover them during this semester. You should be able to use the environmental file that I gave you pretty much out of the box after you swap the API key out, and it will all work. Okay? So just assume that when you call this function, you have ChatGPT available for programmatic control. You can pass a message, you can pass a system prompt, and you get a response. Okay? But you don't do that through this class. This class is the actual connection to ChatGPT. You do that through this function, handle AI chat request. That's the function in routes.py that was here at the end, right? The very last thing we did that we wanted to return back to the front end. How do I know it's going to the front end? Well, because who called this? It was Vue, right? Remember the Vue.js route over here in ChatView called chat AI. So when we return down here, we're going to be returning to the front end, this response. Okay, so let's go look at what handle AI chat request actually does. So it's actually pretty simple. It gets the conversation history from the session if it's available. It takes the system prompt that was passed in as an argument. If there is no system prompt, it gets a default from your application's configuration. And then it sends the message to the LLM. In this case, the LLM client that we chose was ChatGPT. So we're going to send this to the LLM client. If it's successful, we'll append to the conversation history what was covered, the question that was just asked, and then we're going to process and emit the message via socket IO back to the front end. Okay? We're also going to return a JSON of the result, and that's it. So let's come here back to routes.py. The three other routes that we have down here handle your authentication routes, so login, which you can see follows a very similar pattern to what we have for all the other routes. There's a dynamic page HTML, which calls login, which is attached to this JS file. Same as what we saw before, there's a template, and then there is some content from Vue.js that takes the email and the password that are passed in the fields, makes a request to process login in the backend, checks if everything's good. If it is, it lets you in. If it's not, it boots you out. Process login is back here in the back. You can see what it does. It makes a call to the database. There's a function called Authenticate that takes the email, the password, basically checks if there's a match. If there is, it lets you in. If there's not, it boots you out. Okay. If you've understood the application till here, you've got pretty much the whole application covered. There's one last thing that I think is worth us covering related to chat with AI. And that is, recall the front end, the Vue.js, calls this route /chat AI, passes in the message, passes in the page content, and it gets back the response. So let's actually go to chat.vue.js. Let's review the submit message content here. I want to review this function with you because if you're going to be changing anything, it's probably going to be in submit message. It's extremely unlikely that you will have to change things in this helper function area that's down here. You're probably going to have to change only things for the homework that are in this short section up here after the setup, all the way through until you get to line 131. Okay? Unless you want to make changes, you're welcome to do that. What does the submit message function do? It's pretty straightforward. It gets the message from HTML, that's what the person typed into the chat. If the message empty, it does nothing. If there is a message, when the submit message has been called, so that's the enter key, for example, or the button to submit, blanks it out. And it sends the message to the chat history window via socket.io so that you can see the message. That's what this does. If you'd like to learn more about how socket.io works in the context of this application, you can see this socket events file. I won't be covering it, but the interface so that you can do live streaming between the front end and the back end is handled using functions in this file. We capture the current page's content. Okay, that's going to be needed. Why? Because we're going to pass that to the back, remember, with /chat/AI. It needs to have access to the page content as well as the message so that it can respond. So here we capture the current page's content. We log the captured content. In this case, for debugging purposes, you could comment this, it's not necessary. And then finally, we send it to the AI. We show this typing indicator, that's just for aesthetics. That's the ... as the AI thinks to respond. We increment the total number of messages that have been sent to the AI in a global store. Again, this is just aesthetic. You could comment it if you wanted to. We then come over here, we update this, this variable, and we send the message to the AI in the back. This send message to AI, again, recall, is sort of the meat of how we actually transact the information to the back end and process the response that comes back. And that's it. This is pretty much how the message is submitted to the back end. So why is this important? Because as you're working on this, it might be the case that in the front end, before you submit something, you may want to do some stuff with it. Where would you do that stuff with the message before you submit it? Well, you're going to do it here, right? In the same place where you have the message and you're capturing the page content. Let's say for a future assignment or your own project, you don't want to send the whole page's content. You only want to send a part of it, or you want to process it in the front end before you send it. You do that here, right? In this submit message function, which is why we're covering it. Handle AI response is the only other function in here that I think you need to know, which is once the AI has responded with the message, this is what handles taking that and doing the display. You can see here we remove the typing indicator. Okay. We add the AI's response to the chat history through add message, which you can see is down there in the helper function. Don't need to touch it unless you want to. And there could be other things we want to do post-response here. Let me give you an example. Let's say that we have the AI agent in the future pass back a color that we want to make the background. Well, maybe here in the front end, when we get that color, we select the element ID, we change the background color. And now we have a way for the AI agent in the back to not only answer questions, but to intervene as well by making changes that the front end actions when it gets the response. So this handling of the AI response will probably also be relevant for your future homework assignments, which is why we're covering it. This should be everything that you need to know. A quick recap of everything we've covered. I suggest you start with routes.py, read through this, follow the code along on your own. If you have an AI agent you like, feel free to ask it so that you can understand things that are unclear. Reach out to us if you have questions. Look through these Vue.js templates for each of the major pages. And I also suggest that you take a look at some of these utilities, the database and the LLM specifically. You can also look at socket events if you're curious, which handles how the messages are emitted. That's it for this tutorial. I think by the time you get used to using this code base, you will be able to extend it to a very large number of applications, not just in this class, but well beyond it. Hope this was helpful. See you in the next video.